Thank you, everybody, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Buenos dias. That's about all the Spanish you're going to get from me, I'm afraid. But thank you for this kind introduction and for inviting me, obviously, to address you here today. In my talk, I will give you, as Jose has just said, some broader context, mainly from a European perspective, on the key issues around television and tablet accessibility as I see them. I'm supposed to also introduce myself very quickly, but I think you've got all the propaganda about me already in your delegate pack, so I'll skip over this fairly swiftly. Just to say that I'm not a proper Englishman. I'm from Belgium originally. I've lived and worked in the UK, in London for the last 10 years now, though. And technology has always been a keen interest to me. I was only about 7 years old when my father taught me the first basics of electronics. And I think I wrote my first computer program before I was 12 years old. So I'm a bit of a geek, I'm sorry to say. My professional career in technology is now 21 years long. And I've been involved in particular in information and communication technology, with research and development and innovation being the central theme. It's probably also useful for me to say that I have worked in the private sector as well as in the disability sector. In 2001, after a private sector career, I was hired by the Royal National Institute for Deaf People to drive their innovation technology department. I left there last April to set myself up as an independent expert, and that's how I'm here in front of you today. Anyway, I think that's enough of the propaganda. So let's move on to the important matter of today's conference. Now, accessibility of television, interactive digital television, why is this important? Because now that we have all these gadgets like mobile phones and computers and all kinds of appliances and contraptions, it's very easy to forget that television is still, and by far, I have to say, the most widely adopted and used information technology. And just to illustrate that fact, based on some 2009 figures I have from the UK, 99% of UK households have a television. Only about 81% of them use mobile phones. And if you then compare this to computers, with only about 75% adoption in households, and not all of these are connected to the internet, then you can see that television is still by far the most widespread piece of information technology that people have in their homes. Perhaps to give another statistic, there's a lot of talk about tablets these days, and with 54.8 million tablets in use in the world today, a lot of which, by the way, are being sold to you by Steve Jobs and Apple these days, right? That's quite a big number. But if you compare this to the 1.5 billion televisions that are in use in the world, then you can see the difference between those two statistics. So television is still the most widespread, and it's also a very much loved information and entertainment service. And so in order to, as a citizen of the modern world, fully participate, access to television is really important. Television brings us news and current affairs. It helps us participate in the democratic process, in elections and so on. It brings us, obviously, documentaries and other educational resources, but it also brings entertainment and recreation. And we shouldn't forget this last part, because enjoyment is needed for our well-being, and television-related conversations are part of the social fabric, be it around the water cooler at work or simply as part of any of our many casual social interactions throughout the day. In short, I think television access really matters. Now, who is affected by television accessibility barriers? Well, if I have just told you that television matters to more or less every one of us, then obviously accessibility of it matters to all of us as well. Now, obviously, having said that, there are some user groups that face very specific challenges in terms of accessing television. And mostly, of course, it's people with sensory disabilities, in particular deaf, hard of hearing, blind, and partially sighted people that are the main target for the accessibility debate in television. And accordingly, the European Audio-Visual Media Services Directive, which lays down the rules for television and on-demand services, it has an accessibility article, Article 3C, which only refers to people with a visual or hearing disability. So that's the restriction within the AVMS directive. Now, obviously, by its very nature of being an audiovisual medium, accessibility of television impacts most heavily on those with hearing or sight-related disabilities. Nevertheless, we shouldn't forget that there are other people affected as well. Often forgotten are persons with cognitive disabilities or mental problems. A modern television or set-top box, a modern digital box, is certainly a lot more difficult to use than a television from the 1970s. You know, it only had two dials, one to turn it on and change the volume, and then the other one to select from a few channels. And it's not just a matter of intellectual capacity either. I've got some good friends who are eye surgeons. They've got about, between the two of them, 25 years of university education, so well-educated people. On a daily basis, they go out and they perform some of the most demanding medical surgery possible. But when they have to program their video recorder to record something, they have to call me and say, can you come and help us out because we can't manage this. Similarly, of course, our intellectual capabilities tend to diminish as part of the aging process. And so again, the complexity that often comes with these newer and more advanced features can produce by itself new access barriers. It's also worth mentioning people with physical disabilities, either motor disorders or simply as a result of disease, such as arthritis, for example, because of accident or simply because of aging. Operating a device or a remote control with lots of small fidgety buttons can be a problem for all these consumers too, and so can touchscreens, by the way, as we find them more on mobile phones and tablets than we used to. So in conclusion, a great many people are affected by television accessibility, and certainly a lot more than just disabled people in the traditional sense of the word. Although at the same time, the problems all these groups face are varied, sometimes overlapping, but frequently with subtle differences between different user groups. That also means that, and this is very important, there is not a single accessibility mechanism. There's not a single accessibility dimension, and there really are no silver bullet solutions or remedies like one-size-fits-all solutions for this. Now, normally, this is kind of the part of the speech where I produce some very impressive statistics for you to show that there are, so many million blind people in Europe, so many millions of hard of hearing persons, and so on, which is true. But there is an additional problem with this, because I can't just go on and say, well, look we have all these millions of people here, and so there is a very simple and easy and massive business case for all of you to develop these highly specialized, sometimes esoteric solutions, and you can sell them and make millions of pounds in doing so. It doesn't quite work like that. Yes, there are many older and disabled people. The number is growing, not in the least because of the aging population. But these numbers cover a whole spectrum of users, from someone with mild hearing loss or sight problems, all the way to profoundly deaf or blind people, or others with entirely different disabilities. Elderly people often combine, fairly mild to moderate impairments as part of the aging process. And all these people have quite different abilities and preferences. And in many ways, these groups are diverse as the rest of us. So there are some real challenges that need to be tackled, and indeed, there are some real market opportunities, but the simplistic view of a massive business case, for a one-size-fits-all solution, I think, is based on a rather misleading understanding of the statistics. All right, let's look in some more detail at the elements of television accessibility. And I talk about television, but a lot of this applies much broader to other applications and devices as well. With regard to a multimedia service like digital television, which is increasingly interactive too, there are several kind of layers, several angles to the problem of accessibility. And to summarize it in one sentence, the problem is made up of two main categories: the accessibility of the content itself and the accessibility of the devices or the applications that deliver the content. So to make television as a service fully accessible, both these two main categories of accessibility matter. Indeed, the sum total accessibility of the service as a whole is only as strong as that of the weakest element in the chain. So if content is made fully accessible, for example, if the disabled user or whoever needs the content cannot actually get to it because of some kind of insurmountable problem in the user interface, then the service has failed completely for that particular user. With regard to content accessibility, there are again kind of two main parts to the problem. The first one is that of foreign language content. The second one is one that has to do with content type or the content modality. I'll go quickly over the issue of foreign language content because this is fairly mainstream, obviously, for all viewers of a channel. And as you know, in general, the solution there is to provide translation, either as a subtitle or by replacing the original audio by a local language version, a technique that's known as dubbing. However, do bear in mind that the translation, just like the rest of the service, is also subject to specific accessibility barriers. Now, a lot more must be said, I think, about content accessibility as it relates to the type, the modality, the nature of the content. And slightly at risk of making a statement of the bleeding obvious here, television is an audio and video, a sound and moving images service. So if you want to fully experience it, you need to be able to hear the sound and watch the video. Now, because it is audio and video, a lot of the accessibility effort, as I said before, is focusing on people with hearing or sight loss. And to remedy barriers to the use of audio and video content, in most of Europe, and indeed the rest of the world, we find a series of specialized services called access services that all try to alleviate specific problems. Let me give you briefly an overview of these access services and their adoption in Europe. I think first and probably best known are subtitles, or as our American friends like to call them, captions. I'm not talking about subtitles now for language translation. I'm talking about subtitling programs in the local spoken language. So here in Spain, I'm talking about subtitles for programs in Spanish. Now, the technology to deliver subtitles has actually been available for many, many decades. In analog television, teletext was devised back in the 1970s as a mechanism for the delivery of subtitles, and it has been used for this purpose in many countries. Digital television still supports kind of a teletext-style delivery mechanism, but it more commonly uses what is known as DVB subtitles, which are essentially a stream of bitmaps, a stream of images of the text. Now, almost all modern digital television equipment supports subtitles, DVB subtitles in this way. And because DVB subtitles are bitmaps, they're not strings of texts, they're not sentences of words. They have some quite clearly identifiable pros and cons associated with them. Because the receiver gets, in effect, a stream of images of text, not the text itself, the system allows broadcasters to display high-quality anti-alias text in a nice font, and the broadcaster knows, that the experience of the subtitles, the presentation is the same for all users. The biggest disadvantage of the method is, of course, that the text is not available to the receiver as a string of characters and words. And this makes it very difficult to create equipment that personalizes the experience, for example, by allowing the user to change the font type or the size, or even to change the position on the screen or the color scheme of the text. And also, even though this situation has improved somewhat, digital recording devices like hard disk recorders and some software applications and catch-up television players on the internet, they need to recognize these subtitle streams and process them correctly. And certainly in the early days of digital television, it was quite common to find recording equipment that just did not record the subtitle stream, or that recorded it but didn't play it back at playback time. As I said, this has improved a lot. And even though subtitling is now a well-established technology, and the cost of providing subtitles, while not entirely trivial, is still small compared to the overall program cost, there remain big differences in the amount and quality of subtitles around Europe. Now, the graph on the slide here, you don't have to be able to see all the detail, but the graph comes from the European Federation of Hard of Hearing People, who's tracking the use of subtitles in Europe. And it's based actually on data from broadcasters themselves. And while it lacks some detail, for example, about the differences between public and commercial broadcasting, as a high-level indication of the patchwork that is subtitling provision in Europe, it does serve its purpose quite well. As you can see, the range in terms of subtitling provision in EU member states goes from countries with really no subtitling to speak of, to countries like the UK, where subtitling now reaches more or less 100% on all the main channels. So we now have, say, BBC One, BBC Two, about 100% of subtitling of English language content. Subtitling is by far the most used access service. It's mainstream enough, actually, to be broadly supported by television equipment and networks. And indeed, while deaf and hard of hearing people are the obvious user group for this, subtitles are most definitely used by a wider audience. People with cognitive difficulties, those like me for whom the spoken vernacular is only a second language, and also if you're watching television with the volume turned down, these are all kind of typical conditions why people use subtitling. And even though in many parts of Europe a lot more needs to be done before you reach this kind of 100% level that we find in the UK everywhere, subtitling is in many ways largely a solved problem. There is more to do, but there are no fundamental technical or economic reasons for why subtitling could not become an entirely pervasive commodity across television. Moving on, however, the second access service I will draw your attention to is audio description, mainly used by blind and partially sighted users. And this is kind of an additional narrative or commentary that describes important visual actions or elements that a blind person would not see, but which are important in order to follow the story. So typically it describes characters or scene changes and on-screen text and other visual clues that are not otherwise picked up by the program sound. And while blind people are the biggest audience for audio description, some people with cognitive disabilities also find it useful in order to be able to follow the program better. Now, in terms of technology, there are two main variants of audio description. One is known as receiver mix, the other as broadcast mix. With receiver mix, the audio commentary is transmitted as a separate audio stream. So you've got two streams. And then the television or the set-top box or the software application combines the normal audio track together with this extra audio description stream and plays it out. With broadcast mix, the audio commentary is mixed with the original audio by the broadcaster and delivered as a separate alternative audio stream. Both these systems have pros and cons. With receiver mix, obviously the end user in principle has more control over the mix, in particular over the volume balance between normal program audio and the audio description commentary. And also the total bandwidth requirement is somewhat less for receiver mix because the audio description narrative can be sent at a very low bit rate. With broadcast mix, because the main audio is transmitted effectively twice, once as a normal audio track and then again in the audio described version, there is more bandwidth needed. Now, obviously, with broadcast mix, the end user has no control over the balance between main audio and the audio description commentary either. However, I have to say that this kind of the theoretical extra user control from receiver mix is in general not used very much. And critically, receiver mix adds some substantial complexity and resource requirements to the television hardware and software logic. This is far less the case for broadcast mix because the ability to find and select between alternative audio streams is already part of basic digital television technology anyway. Now, the existence in Europe of these kind of two different delivery methods is in general, I think, not a good idea, especially not for a niche service like audio description. And I think actually we will see receiver mix gradually disappear, also because the problem of bit rate that it tries to resolve really only applies to terrestrial transmission where spectrum remains a scarce commodity. For cable, satellite, and even IP TV, over broadband scenarios, the extra AD bandwidth needed for broadcast mix is not really that relevant. Now, the UK has been an audio description pioneer and currently offers, relatively substantial amounts of audio description, especially on the main BBC channels, where it now reaches about 20%. So BBC One, BBC Two, you get about 20% of audio description, which is a lot more than you tend to get in most other European countries. The BBC actually has been making regular audio description broadcasts since 2000. And in the early years, equipment support for AD was patchy, but now that AD is more common and also increasingly used in other countries, in particular the USA, which has helped drive the market, support for AD in televisions is a lot better than it used to be. Now, another key factor in support of AD in getting these services out there has been in the UK what we call the targeted help scheme for switchover, which has helped drive the awareness and usage of AD quite a bit. Now, what is this help scheme? Well, for many people, the transition from analog to digital television can be challenging, in particular for vulnerable citizens such as the very elderly and some categories of disabled people. Now, in order to provide financial and practical help, the UK government set up what is known as the Switchover Help Scheme. And eligible persons would receive clear and simple explanations. They will receive easy-to-use equipment, home installation, they get a replacement aerial if needed, and on-site and telephone assistance and advice. Now, apart from the obvious benefits of such a scheme to help people deal with the impact of changing from analog to digital television, the scheme has also helped to drive support for accessibility and access services. And that is because equipment that is being handed out by the scheme has to meet high accessibility standards and must support access services, including subtitling and audio description. As I said, audio description has benefited particularly from this. Elsewhere in Europe and the world, we see that AD remains much more marginal. Next, I want to move briefly on to sign language interpretation. Some deaf people do not use written language, as in subtitles, as their first language, but they use visual languages known as sign languages. Now, it's a common misunderstanding, which I find everywhere in Europe, to assume that these sign languages are simply visual representations of the spoken language of the land. Now, for many sign languages, including British Sign Language, this is not the case. British Sign Language is not based on English. It's not kind of a visual form of English. It's very different in its sentence structure, in its semantics, in its vocabulary. It's a language in its own right. Now, other languages, such as, for example, German Sign Language, are more closely related to the spoken language. So German Sign Language is much more closely related to spoken German than is the case for British Sign Language, for instance. Now, the sign language community is generally a small subset of all deaf and hard of hearing people, but it is a group that is often deeply disenfranchised. Now, having sign language interpreted television programs available helped that particular group in accessing television quite a bit. Now, quite a few countries in Europe offer at least some sign language interpretation on television, often by broadcasting signed repeats overnight. And they do it overnight because the sign language interpreting can, in contrast to subtitling or audio description, not be turned on or off. So you don't have a button on your remote to turn on and off the sign language. It's delivered as part of the main image. It's kind of burned into the image, as it were. And we call that way of delivering sign language open signing. And of course, while that helps deaf sign language users, it's very unpopular with mainstream audiences, and broadcasters always get complaints from the public about it. So obviously a better way of delivering sign language would be to use closed signing, which can be switched on and off. Now, technically, we could do this. You know, you can put the sign language in its own stream and create a system to allow that to be switched on and off. But you would need some kind of standardized mechanism for the control and the signaling of it all. And, of course, because you have an additional video stream, it uses quite a bit of bandwidth. Now, bandwidth is a scarce resource, and sign language there is competing with much more mainstream purposes, and so this hasn't yet happened. Now, my former team at R&ID and I worked with the BBC on a prototype for closed signing. We actually demonstrated that at the IBC International Broadcasting Conference in Amsterdam way back in 2005. But there just isn't enough support as yet for this, and as I say, work would need to be done to kind of standardize the technical delivery means on networks and in televisions and set-top boxes. And even if you do all that, broadcasters would then still need to produce the content for it. Now, sign language interpretation is very expensive and therefore, you know, makes this quite problematic as well. I've also been involved in things like avatar-based signing, where we use computer-generated animations to sign, but we don't really, I think, have time to go into the detail of this right now, although I'm happy to take discussions about this further offline, perhaps during the coffee break. For now, I just want to say with regard to avatar-based signing, computer-based signing, that it's really not a very realistic model today for things like television. Now, number 4 on the list of access services, which I think you don't have in Spain yet, but correct me if I'm wrong, is spoken subtitles. As I already said, some countries translate foreign programs by means of subtitles. Now, that's all good and well, and you know, indeed, in my personal opinion, subtitles are the better way of doing this than dubbing. I mean, you know, watching Homer Simpson speak French or German, it really doesn't work for me, I have to say. But you know, somehow the voices never seem to match the character. But the obvious problem with subtitles for translation is that they're not visible to blind people, and that some people with cognitive difficulties can struggle to watch the program and read the subtitles at the same time. So some countries in Europe, in particular in the Nordic regions, they take the translating subtitles that are already being broadcast and they speak them out using a computer text-to-speech program, standard kind of TTS program. That spoken output is then streamed as an alternative audio stream which end users can select instead of the normal audio. It's not a perfect solution, but it's a good example, I think, of meeting a somewhat niche need using existing technology in a way that improves accessibility. Now, because from the receiver perspective, this is just another audio stream. It uses standard DVB delivery mechanisms. The television or the set-top box does not need any special support for this. The actual text-to-speech conversion is done by the broadcaster. And like with audio description, you need some extra bandwidth to do this, but it is fairly limited compared to video signals. And in many cases, you can just use existing DVB mechanisms and equipment to support this. The last access service I want to mention briefly is one that actually doesn't really exist yet, other than in experimental form. It's a bit surprising, actually, in light of the number of people affected by the problem it aims to resolve. And I'm talking about clean audio. Now, to understand the problem it's trying to solve, I need to first point out that modern television programs tend to have almost continuous background sound behind all programs, including news and current affairs. Now, this is done for mood reasons and artistic reasons, but it creates quite a widespread problem for people with hearing loss, even if you only have a mild hearing loss, such as what happens indeed to the 1 in 2 people of over 60. This is because of a very common consequence of hearing loss, namely that people experience difficulty in discerning the speech from the background, and it means that speech that is over background noise becomes blurred, it becomes hard to follow. And in fact, the hearing apparatus no longer properly separates out the different components of sound. Tuning up the volume will not help, it may indeed exacerbate the problem, and the louder the background noise, the stronger intelligibility is affected. So the term clean audio refers to kind of the technical means and processes of delivering cleaned up audio. You could simply provide an alternative audio stream with the dialogue but without the background sound, or with multi-channel audio systems, you could put the dialogue in a different channel and then allow the user to change the balance between foreground and background. Of course, broadcasters could simply create content in a better way as well. The main problem with clean audio is that even though it's really a big problem for a surprisingly large group in Europe, at the same time it remains largely a hidden problem. And despite the fact it keeps being brought up, very little progress has been made to create a full end-to-end solution in Europe. I need to move on again, but if you're interested, and the link is on the slide, there is a free short paper about clean audio on my website for those of you who are interested in it. Now, I've spoken at quite some length about making content more accessible through access services. And I guess that despite the fact that more progress is needed, things are really happening. I mean, services are being delivered, targets go up. But as I stated before, content accessibility is only part of the answer. Equipment also needs to be accessible and usable, and while there are some examples of good practice, I think it's fair to say that there remain significant challenges in this area. Now, part of the problem is that the look and feel of a television or a set-top box, you know, the menu structure, the design of the remote control, all these things, they're very sensitive for manufacturers, and they play a big role in their branding, in their marketing strategies. And so, not only don't they want to be distracted by accessibility requirements, but many in the industry actively believe that accessibility leads to blender, less appealing interfaces. I don't really think that's true, by the way. And despite the many features of modern systems, the lack of user-friendliness and the basic accessibility create a barrier that is much larger than manufacturers seem to either understand or accept. And that impacts on marketing and branding as well. Just to give one example, although perhaps a bit of an ironic one, here are the instructions for how to turn on audio description permanently on a Sky Plus HD set-top box. On the top menu, single screen navigation, select options. Then select subtitles from the middle menu. Remember, we're talking about audio description, right? Select subtitles from the middle menu. This will then bring up the following menu. Choose audio description on/off, change to on. Highlighted programs, choose audio description. Beep on audio description, change to on. Once you have selected what you want, press the green button to save. Now just look at it, you know. What a mess. Why did anybody think, for example, it was a great idea to put audio description on/off in the subtitles menu? You know, what's that all about? Now remember also that on top of that, blind people are the biggest audio description users. Just try and get this done if you can't even see the screen on your set-top box. Now at the same time, it has to be said that usability and accessibility can be quite tricky to get right. It requires a lot of thought. It requires careful design and testing to produce clean, easy-to-use interfaces that work for most people. Now, very important is that you must include accessibility and usability from the early stages of design and implementation, from day one. If you do not, you will have to retrofit accessibility to an existing product or service, and that is really hard work. It's really complicated and often quite expensive as well. If, on the other hand, you make it part of your development from day one, it all becomes a lot simpler and a lot cheaper. Now, two specific accessibility topics have received a bit of attention over the last few years in Europe. The first one is the issue of accessible remote controls. Now, some companies have spent quite some effort to improve the kind of general accessibility and usability of their remote controls. Traditionally, for example, the Sky remote is received well by many users, including blind people. There are also specialized remotes on the market with, you know, like the very big button remote controls or remotes that only have a few buttons for key functions instead of several dozen. But it remains a problem that the infrared codes and the protocols being used are so diverse, and they're not adequately documented for some of the manufacturers. So if you buy a third-party, more accessible remote, you might find it's tricky to get it to work with some of the products on the market. The second topic is that of talking devices, mainly, obviously, for use by blind people. At the moment, Sky has a product on the market called the Sky Talker. And in the UK, RNIB, the Royal National Institute for the Blind, worked with Harvard to produce this box on the slide, which is called Smart Talk, and it's a talking Freeview digital television set-top box. Here in Spain, I've seen ONCE and Inteco demonstrate a talking system based on an existing mainstream product. But in general, availability of talking television equipment across Europe remains quite low, and most markets in Europe have no availability of a product at all. Now, it seems to me that a key problem is that the talking function of such products is just not mainstream enough to include it in most products. So technically, it's quite doable, but the extra cost, the development effort, and also the support issues remain a stumbling block in what is a highly competitive market for a feature that has not a massive audience for it. Now, I've been involved in some standardization work in collaboration with European manufacturers, and more recently, globally within IEC, to develop a functional specification for talking television equipment. And I think that the next step should be to design software and hardware interfaces for television equipment in such a way that you could easily connect a third-party talking interface to standard products as available on the high street. So, you would buy a normal television and then connect it via USB or even a wireless connection to your own talking device that would speak out the menus, the program guides, etc. Ideally, that same talking device could then be used to connect other devices in your home, perhaps even white goods at some stage. I believe fundamentally that this more open design of television products can be used to address other accessibility problems. We've seen that. Now, at this point, I'd like to very briefly touch upon the legal and regulatory situation in Europe, because a lot of the drive behind accessibility comes from the legal and regulatory support. Now, as I mentioned in the beginning, television is the most widely adopted technology, and it's therefore key to full participation and opportunity. This is widely understood by parliaments, by governments, and other legal and regulatory stakeholders. In Europe, for example, the 2005 Riga Declaration and the communication on e-accessibility of the same year, and also the I-2010 initiative on e-inclusion, they all make direct and explicit reference to the importance of television accessibility. We've already mentioned the Audiovisual Media Services Directive, which encourages member states to address television accessibility for people with hearing or sight loss. But another important instrument is the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. Now, the convention formulates a general kind of accessibility duty under Article 9, but in addition, it also makes specific reference to television access services in Article 31. So all EU member states have signed the convention. Most have completed the ratification progress. In addition to the member states, the EU itself is also a signatory to the convention in its own right and will be overseeing implementation of the convention and thus of the television accessibility provisions by the member states. Now, this in turn is referred to in what was already mentioned earlier today, the EU's Disability Strategy 2010-2020, which mentions television right at the start. And finally, as I think many of you are aware, Europe is currently looking at a 2012 European Accessibility Act in which television accessibility might feature extensively. There are also stuff outside Europe that influences European markets, like the USA's 21st Century Communications and Video Accessibility Act of 2010. It's really important because it influences global markets, and the Act strengthens access service provision and other facilities with a strong focus on deaf, hard of hearing, blind, and partially sighted users. Now, there are some EU member states that go further than that and have additional national legislation and regulation. For example, in the UK, we have the Communications Act 2003, which imposes minimum levels of subtitling, audio description, and sign language interpreters on most broadcasters, and also makes sure that these levels gradually increase. The detail of the Act is a bit complex, but in practice what it means is that on average more than 70 channels, both public service broadcasting as well as commercial channels, have to provide access services. The main BBC channels now provide 100% of subtitles for English language programs. For ITV1 and Channel 4, the target is 90%, and for 5, it is 80%. For audio description, the target at the moment is 10% for most of the main channels, but they all exceed this target at the moment, and the BBC has now been committed to provide 20% of audio description on these channels. Sign language is a bit of a special case. The target for the most channels there is about 5%, but there is also a special sign language community channel that is funded by the broadcasters and available to sign language users. Now, if you look at the overall statistics, both the UK and Spain actually do reasonably well. I mean, UK is delivering quite high levels overall. But for Europe as a whole, the picture is a lot more mixed. And in some member states, it is, little or nothing. Now, we can't discuss this all here, but a good starting point to look at the differences in Europe is a study that was commissioned by the European Commission. My Department of Technology was involved with this. And the study is called Measuring Progress in E-Accessibility in Europe, or MEAC in short. And what MEAC and other studies and resources clearly demonstrate is this. Legislation and regulation play a very important role in driving accessibility. It's not just a matter of technology, it's not just a matter of what's technically feasible. Public policy has a lot to do with how serious the market and others take accessibility. Now, I draw in particular your attention to this graph from the MEAC report. And what it shows is that there is a direct correlation, a direct link between the strength of public policy support for accessibility and the situation on the ground. So countries which have better cover for accessibility in policy show a significantly better state of accessibility than those where policy is weak. And I also suggest that there is another related factor, which is the strength of user lobby groups. I mean, the UK traditionally has a strong charity sector that is influential and lobbies vigorously on behalf of disabled people and others. In Spain, you have powerful and large organizations like ONCE. So these all help influence the debate. And of course, strong legislation can be correlated to strong user groups too. In any event, a strong voice for disabled people and a potent legal and regulatory framework, the key instruments in driving accessibility in practice. Technology helps. The increased possibilities of modern technology make it possible to do things we could not do before and to do it at a reasonable cost, but it needs to be supported by a policy framework and advocacy and awareness by user groups. We're running out of time, but very briefly, I want to conclude by looking ahead. I have spoken in large part about television in a fairly traditional form. I mean, digital television is now part of tradition as well. But to conclude, I'd like to finish by broadening the debate a little bit. After all, my career is in research and development, in innovation, and I think the most interesting part is actually in looking at the future of television. Now, what is absolutely certain is that television is changing. The way we consume television programs is changing. A few decades ago, television was really kind of this intense, largely passive and isolated viewing and listening experience. Today, television is increasingly competing and sitting alongside gaming, multimedia, social networking, on computers, on tablets, and mobile phones, and in particular for younger people. Now, television is being watched increasingly on those other devices too, instead of just a traditional television set. According to recent Ofcom research in the UK, while still 2/3 of media and communications activity conducted by people over 55 is through a television or radio set, by contrast, in the 16 to 24 age group, almost 6 out of 10 spent most of their media and communications time on a computer, on a mobile phone, or on another handheld device. 6 out of 10 of the 16 to 24-year-olds. Another fact, according to some recent American research, checking Facebook is now the consensus top activity for young people during commercial breaks. And so what we see is that television is not just technically converging with the internet and with computers, tablets, and mobiles, but increasingly as a service and as an experience, it's fused with social networking, websites, message boards, and so on. This is not something on the horizon. This is happening today. You can now buy televisions that have internet applications on them. Indeed, my Sony TV at home is fully internet connected. I frequently use my embedded BBC iPlayer on it. I do things like watch the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra on it to their digital concert hall, which is an internet-based service. And you can now watch, say, a game show or an episode of The Apprentice or a football match, and at the same time see a live Twitter feed of comments about the program next to it and participate in it. Now take it one step further, and you could be watching a television program on your main television, but sitting on the sofa, you would have your tablet or your smartphone, and it would be, showing a website about the program where you could leave messages, or you could vote for one of the candidates, or just see some background information and related items, and so on. This is service convergence. This is bringing together different media, different systems to create an even better and even more interactive experience. This is not some far-flung futuristic prospect, right? All of this is happening as we speak. Now, I'd love to talk in more detail about all of this, but I'm afraid my time has now run out, and I need to link all of this with the accessibility issues. So, from an accessibility perspective, these new forms of television, the convergence with other services, represents both an opportunity as well as a threat. It's a threat because suddenly we have a whole lot more systems and menus and controls that need to be designed for accessibility and for usability. And if you believe it is difficult enough to make traditional linear television fully accessible, wait until you start looking at the problems of interactive digital television applications. Just think about how difficult a problem something like web accessibility really is. We've been discussing this for at least 15 years, and we still haven't resolved the problem. Now, on top of that, there's great pressure on all the companies that are working on these new systems to produce equipment with all these new features and to make it commercially successful. So accessibility doesn't really feature very high on the list of things to do, and when there's a choice between the commercial view and the accessibility requirement, most of the time the commercial interest wins. But on the other hand, these newer ways of consuming television, they also open up the closed boxes and services from the past. Because to make all of this work, content and software and hardware APIs and interfaces, they all need to be more standardized. They all need to be more open. And that, of course, creates an opportunity to harness these more open, well-documented, standardized platforms to create new accessibility solutions, either in the form of specialized apps running on these secondary devices, or by taking the television content and repurposing it, re-rendering it in a more accessible and personalized way for users with special needs. On this positive note of opportunity and optimism about the future, I will conclude my presentation. The future is an undisclosed and undiscovered country because we can make it into whatever we want. The technology of the modern information society can be used to make key services like digital television richer, more appealing, and ultimately more accessible and more usable for all of us. If we do that, we will make the information society into a more inclusive society. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Yo quería de todas maneras agradecerle a Guido su presencia aquí y ¿por qué, si hablamos de que las políticas están relacionadas con un mayor impacto y desarrollo de la accesibilidad, no se regula esto a nivel del Parlamento Europeo para que después se transponga a cada país? ¿Existe ya esta vía?
I think one of the key problems is that there is a lot happening in Europe, but European legislation and directives tend to have to cater for very different types of member states, not just legally very different, with very different legal systems, but also economically and socially and culturally very different. So what you tend to get in Europe is very much a move towards a lowest common denominator, which tends to depress down the requirement rather than put it up. And I think that's a key problem.